Should we go ahead and get started? All right. Everybody ready? So we got to talking about network segmentation and sort of the reasons why we don't see it more often when we go out and look at particular networks. And there's a sort of a common thread. So we got to talking about WannaCry and other things that go ahead and spread across networks. And it seems to be there's pretty wide consensus that network segmentation is a commonly accepted solution to going ahead and containing these particular threats. But at the same time, like I said, we don't see it all that often. And so why is that? And a lot of times we say, well, it's hard to do and people are lazy and just kind of move on. But I wanted to give a chance to talk about constructive reasons of why people don't do these things and start to talk through ways to break down those particular barriers. So I want to start by defining a little bit about what we're talking about as far as network segmentation, good segmentation, and bad segmentation, just to be clear exactly on the concepts. And then we're going to go ahead and break that down a little bit further. But we see a lot of DMZs for web servers. We see a lot of guest networks or BYOD. But then we don't see anything beyond that. And wanted to talk about why and ways to get beyond that. So me, things I've done in the past. So I started out way back when as a Windows systems admin back in the NetWare days, and then moved on to firewall administration. Have served as a network engineer for a little bit, and then got promoted up to a managing director. So I was in charge of budgets and in charge of staff doing network segmentation projects. And then left that and became a security consultant at Rapid7, helping people out with their particular networks and advising and trying to figure out why these sorts of things weren't happening and ways to improve them. The other reason is, as I was going through this and I was thinking about the reasons why people don't do network segmentation, I had made a lot of these bad excuses myself. And so I'll be going through some of them, but I'm as guilty as just about everybody else. So I'm going to try not to call these things excuses. I'm going to call them barriers because I feel bad for also making these particular excuses. Everybody hear me okay? Okay, cool. So, play a little bit of game, wake everybody up or whatever else. I'm going to go ahead and read these out, and I'm going to go ahead and raise my hand right now because I've said all of these things. But if you've said these things, or if you've heard these things, or if you've gotten pushback on these particular things, go ahead and raise your hand. So, reasons why people don't do network segmentation will be seen as disruptive if we block business-related traffic, and we'll get a few steps in, and they'll go ahead and push back. Okay. Probably the most common one. If the attackers have gotten this far, they already own us already, so why bother? Okay, awesome. We're not staffed to conduct or maintain an internal segmentation effort of this magnitude. We can't do this and our day jobs. Okay, awesome. And then our firewall cannot handle all the internal traffic. So if we route everything to it, it's just going to overload it, so let's not bother. And the budget won't account for buying the other one. Okay, so a little bit less common, but still fairly common. Again, sort of the agenda, we're going to go ahead and break those down or bunch them up into to three main categories. And so discuss different ways to go ahead and attack the too hard to do, it's impossible to maintain once you have set it up, and then the tech or budget can't particularly handle it. So we'll talk about defeating those particular things. I'll give a few reflections in terms of when I've gone ahead and run these projects, ways to kind of defeat other social barriers that you go ahead and hit as well. And then we'll have time for QA, hopefully, if I don't go on too long about stories. If you have any questions during the presentation, go ahead and just fire them off. Let me know. As far as putting this together, I started diving into various rabbit holes as far as tangents. And there are quite a few tangents. There are quite a few ways to improve network segmentation by doing other control areas as well. And so things like endpoint protection, data classification, a number of other control areas definitely play into this. And they're all part of a good defense in depth strategy. That being said, we can't cover possibly all of those things. So I'm going to try to steer as close as I can to the center of network segmentation, but we're going to dive into a few alternate topics as we go through. So let's start out by defining what we mean by good network segmentation, but it's sometimes difficult to go ahead and do that. So we're going to start with what bad segmentation is. We know what bad segmentation looks like. We know that the crunchy exterior and the chewy center is a really, really bad model. And so when I go in and look at particular networks for clients, we see a lot of things where they basically have an implicit trust model, where everything internal is at a high level of security, and then the low level of security for the DMZ and other external assets. And basically, everything internal has carte blanche to everything external, but there's also that free reign inside that particular environment. So that's what we're talking about, bad segmentation, where file servers, database servers, app servers, staff, network management segments, backup segments, all of that can see all of each other. And so we see a ton of lateral movement possibilities. And so I spent a lot of time talking to penetration testers as well, and talking about exactly what things would slow them down in an environment like this. And by and large, what they said was actual segmentation. Give me a maze, give me a challenge a little bit to try to run through that, and then set up some sort of detection in and around that maze. What we also see is a lot of implicit allow ACLs, and this is sort of default behavior on a lot of firewalls and a lot of networks as well, where you kind of set one particular zone and then you can kind of waterfall down into any other zone that's beneath that. And so we want to look at implicit ACLs as well. One of the things that when I talk to clients is I ask them, do you have separate VLANs? Do you have network segmentation? They say, absolutely, we have VLANs. And I say, do you have any ACLs between them? No. They just use them purely for addressing. That's not what we're talking about as segmentation. We can go ahead and use those things. Those are nice structures to go ahead and build preventive controls around, but that's not what we're talking about as far as segmentation goes. And then the last thing, and this isn't what I put in the slide, but the print and copier networks and all of the other networks where people don't think about mounting attacks from, but our penetration testers absolutely love staying resident on non-computer devices and leveraging attacks from there. So just be aware that those things also play into your internal segmentation strategy as well. So what are we talking about as far as good segmentation then? So DMZs and guest networks are a great start. BYOD is a great start. Basically walling that stuff off and keeping it and having it internet egress only is awesome. But then we need to do a lot further segmentation, and that's where we see it breaking down. So we see some PCI networks that are walled off. We see some HIPAA networks that are walled off. But pretty much everything else as far as internal segmentation seems to be wide open. And so again, we've got that sort of, crunchy exterior, chewy center model. And so this is sort of common sense stuff. I'm just going to rifle through it, and then we're going to be getting into the real meat of the talk. But we need to define internal boundaries. So those internal boundaries could be made based on proprietary and confidential information, data locations, so key locations where you're going ahead and storing all of your core data, role-based access as well, so who needs what, and then falling back to a least privilege model. And again, like I said, these things are common sense, but if they're such common sense, why aren't we seeing them more often? So let's dive into a couple of the barriers that we're seeing. Internal network segmentation is too difficult, which is we'll be seen as disruptive if we block business-related traffic. We'll get a few steps in, and then we'll go ahead and push back. And the second one is if attackers have gotten this far, they already own us. That's an excuse that I made to a penetration tester who pointed out that he could get considerable lateral movement inside a data center switch. And I was like, look, if you've got physical access to the switch, the game's up. And I got in a little bit of trouble for that, which I'll be talking about. So when we're talking about going ahead and doing non-disruptive change and applying ACLs in a live environment to go ahead and segment an environment, there's some of the philosophy of going ahead and charging in and saying, well, I'm going to go ahead and block it and see who screams. And I did that for a little bit in the start of my career. It doesn't work, and you guys know that as well. And so you're not going to get far if you go ahead and take that approach. But if you take a slow and steady approach, and if you pick a particularly predictable target, and one of the things that I recommend is don't pick IT first. Pick somebody that probably has separation of responsibility. Payroll is a really, really good example, or AR, AP, finance type functions, because one, they're very rigid processes, or usually fairly rigid processes. They're fairly well documented. There's already role separation there. And they're usually, they're fairly clear in terms of who can do what, and so that's a great place to start. They're also generally tend to work in, sort of sprints as well. So they'll go ahead and do an entire month, they'll close or whatever, and then they'll have that gap period for a little bit where you can go ahead and work with them. And so they'll have kind of a predictable workflow as well. And so when we're talking about doing this, what I'm talking about is going ahead and taking an analysis of what traffic they do. So looking at the allows that they've got. So say you've got a really, really broad rule right now that just basically says all internal traffic can get to all servers. All right, let's take a really, really good guess at this payroll department and what servers they need access to. And so you start looking at your overall server, listing, and you take a good guess and say, okay, they're going to need, SSH, let's hope not Telnet, but SSH and HTTPS to these particular servers. But then that's a guess, right? So beneath that, we're going to go ahead and say this group then has a good amount of, latitude, call it TCP any or something like that, or a broader amount. But you're going to narrow down the group and then go ahead and allow. And then you're going to go ahead and put, maybe possibly, if you're feeling brave, a specific deny underneath that. And so you can go ahead and start narrowing that down. And then if you have hits to that broader rule, you can go ahead and start making more and more specific rules. And so that's what I'm referring to as far as non-disruptive change. You're going to basically have specific allow, broader allow, keep on guessing. And then as those things start rolling up, you're going to go ahead and add those back through. It's sort of what I call the coin slot model approach, basically how, coin counter works or whatever else. It rolls through, and as it hits that slot, it goes ahead and drops through. But then the very, very last tray goes ahead and catches the rest of it. And so you rinse and repeat based on those sorts of things until you have a fairly good idea that these things are going to be segmented. And this seemed like a really, really good approach for me. The problem was I wasn't thinking about in terms of overall time. And so I would do this for weeks and then stop and then say, okay, I've got it. I'm going to go ahead and wrap it. I'm going to go ahead and put a deny down at the bottom. And then there would be a monthly or a yearly process that would go ahead and break in some way. And then I would, be that disruptive network segmentation guy that got blamed for absolutely everything. And so you do have to kind of take a longer approach, but you also learn as you go through this what questions to ask and what, for instances, to give the people that you're talking to be able to say, hey, do you have these other processes? Oh, you have auditors that come in once a year, and they're going to be on a completely different segment. They're going to need this. Let's go ahead and add an ACL for them and just disable it to allow them to go ahead and connect later on. And you just go ahead and comment it, possibly link it to a wiki, something like that to call it out to remind yourself, hey, there's going to be your yearly audit that's also going to need this particular rule. And then you kind of move through and pick another target and kind of roll. When I talked about not doing IT first, IT is a high priority target. Any penetration tester, any actual hacker is going to be going for accounts within that realm, right? Because you can get a ton of movement once you get those accounts. And so you do want to take that in the first wave, if you will, but you don't want to do that absolutely first. But you kind of, earn your stripes in terms of going ahead and doing these particular rule sets, and then you go back to IT and go ahead and do that one as well. So there will be last-minute requests. There will always be this. So you're going to be going ahead and starting to segment things out, and then somebody will come up to your desk and they'll be like, hey, I know I didn't put in a ticket. I know I didn't talk to you guys. The technicians are already here. The server's already here. We've already gone ahead and bought this. We need you to just go ahead and add a broad rule right now. We don't have time for all this security stuff. I've heard it a million times. It still happens. And one strategy that I did, and I kind of winged it, so I made up a policy that I then, told them, hey, you're gonna have to go ahead and do this. So I was gonna go ahead and add a broad rule for them, but I told them, you owe me 3 meetings after this point. You owe me a meeting in a week, you owe me a meeting in a month, and you owe me a meeting in 3 months. To basically go through and look at what the business workflow is for this particular solution that you're going ahead and setting up. And then, is this all the traffic? So you kind of go through and say, are these all the people that are going to connect? And we had that discussion about, are you going to do a monthly or yearly process as well? And then, because I'd made it up, I immediately rushed off to my boss and said, hey, I just made a policy up. Can we go ahead and make this an actual policy? And he said, well, 1, sure. 2, don't ever do that again or I'll burn you. I don't advise necessarily doing that, but I do advise kind of having that quid pro quo relationship. And the neat thing is that the next person who came up who asked for a last-minute request apparently already knew about this setup. And so they were like, hey, I know you're going to ask me for 3 meetings. I already documented this. Can we skip the first one? And so, I was grinning from ear to ear. I'm like, sure, absolutely. So he documented the business process, talked about other things that he needed to do, possibly monthly and going forward. And so I'd won at that point for a certain extent. And so I could go ahead and do the last minute request and still keep up with the segmentation effort. As I was going through and doing network segmentation, I ran into a barrier that I had not anticipated, which was I was sort of pushing back at the business, but not in a healthy way. So I was going up to them and I was telling them how hard my job was and how much I had to do, and I just need you to get me this information so I can just get through this and move on. And it wasn't necessarily working out well for me. And so I had a ton of issues in terms of doing non-disruptive change, people fighting back at me, generally just getting, a bad rap in terms of the business. And my boss kind of pulled me aside and said, there's 2 ways to do things, the easy way and the right way. And if you do things the right way long enough, they become easy. And I got really sick of that statement. And he wrote it on his whiteboard and would point at it every once in a while. But it became rules that I kind of lived by, which was I was going about it and saying, look, I need the easiest possible path, the shortest path to going ahead and getting the network segmentation strategy done. And I didn't want to do anything else outside of that particular strategy to go ahead and get to my objective. And I was running into a ton of friction that way. One of the things that I didn't do is that I didn't document everything. And so I was documenting the who, what, when, where. All of the things that I needed in order to create firewall rules and do all of the remarks for those things. But I wasn't documenting the why and the how. And if I didn't know exactly why these things were important to the business, and I didn't know necessarily how these things transpired, I didn't anticipate the next questions. And so I was constantly running into brick walls in terms of that. And it took me quite a while to learn that if I asked those questions, I not only knocked down that particular battle, but I won a bunch of battles ahead of time that I didn't even realize. And so one of the things that I would say to you guys is don't kind of make that same mistake. If you can go ahead and document the why and the how, not only is it going to help you in your particular initiative, but as you onboard people into your security team or to do firewall administration, they're going to be able to go ahead and read that, or they're going to be able to go ahead and follow a remark to a wiki that goes ahead and details why this is important. So yeah, this is a payroll rule. So this is how everybody gets paid. I like getting paid, but I also now understand. Okay, they're going to have tax responsibilities as well. So right around tax season, I could probably expect some other sort of connectivity patterns. And so again, kind of clues into that whole strategy. The first few workflows are not going to necessarily go well. And so the other thing that I would say is keep pushing. And that's probably the number one issue that I see with network segmentation is I'll go ahead and look down a set of firewall rules, and there's like 400 rules that are really, really specific, and then there's an any allow at the bottom that's not logged in any way. And so they're not even tracking. They just have completely lost momentum on it. And it happens more often than you'd think. I mean, it happened to me as well, where we lost momentum on this thing a couple times because we have these fights, because we have this pushback. So you iterate, you keep learning, and if you keep pressure on it to a certain extent, you'll actually make forward progress, and it will get quite a bit easier. But the other thing is that just like any big project, call it NAC, call it virtualization, server consolidations in the past, when you're doing network segmentation, you're going to be that guy that's blamed for everything. And so if the coffee tastes bad, all of a sudden it's going to be the network segmentation guy's fault. And it's the way it is. And so learn to kind of deflect that, or learn not to take it personally, not let it get to you to a certain extent. The other one is, like I said, an excuse that I made to a pen tester, basically, which is, if you've gotten this far, the game's up anyway. So you've gotten physical access to the data center, I don't care at this point. It's game's up. And I actually gave that flippant response back to a pen tester who went ahead and took that answer and wrote it into the particular evaluation, and it went up the chain. And I got pulled aside, and it was nice in the sense that it wasn't a punitive type thing. But my VP kind of pulled me aside and said, look, it's not your particular job to learn where to declare defeat. That's the responsibility of the guy who's signing your paycheck. And so absolutely don't start picking ground in which you're going to go ahead and give up. I want you to treat everything as absolute defensible ground. So I want you to go back and think about the switch and say, hey, how could I defend this better? Even if I can't go ahead and replace the switch right now, what things can I do to absolutely not only improve the physical security, but also remediate this particular gap? And don't go ahead and ignore certain gaps in the environment and just say, hey, those are beyond anything that we need to worry about. And when we started doing that, we started also simulating attacks from odd vantage points. And so I talked about printers, but also backup networks. We found that our backup network was incredibly permissive, and it went ahead and allowed access to pretty much every server network without any sort of ACLs or any sort of alerting for movement in the environment that happened at times other than when we typically ran the backups. And so if things are traversing your backup network in large quantities, and it's not time for a backup or you're not doing a major restore, that should be something that should have a detective control around it. So you should have some sort of alerting. We simulated attacks as well from DR, dev, QA, and test environments. And initially we didn't really care about those things because they didn't contain production data. But what we didn't realize after talking to a pen tester, we realized is that they mimicked the structures and all of the data types that were going to be in production. And so it was a perfect practice environment for exactly how to go ahead and breach production. And so we had absolutely no alerting because we didn't care. Usually the devs and the QA people or whatever else would break QA or test, and we would just let them do that. We didn't want the alert fatigue associated with doing it. But then we had no vision whatsoever into when a attacker was going ahead and testing out techniques in dev and QA, these cloned environments, even though they didn't contain data that was really important. And so that's something else that we learned as well, is basically simulating attacks in our environment and looking for ways to further segment. The second issue, or the second barrier that we're going to be talking about is once you go ahead and set this up, it's fairly difficult to maintain. So it takes quite a bit of effort. Each new thing that comes up, you're going to have to go ahead and try to go ahead and segment it out. Or every time you're changing an application, every time you're doing a business workflow change, you're going to have a ton of work as far as going ahead and segmenting things out. And so the typical response is we're not staffed to conduct or maintain the segmentation effort of this magnitude. So we can't do this in our day jobs. I rarely see IT teams when I'm consulting that are grossly overstaffed or that are bored. Typically, they're running like mad, going ahead and running down tickets or going ahead and trying to figure out how to get ahead of the next particular burden that they've got, be it an audit burden or some sort of business workflow burden. But what I often see as well is organizations that purchase way too many or conflicting or overlapping security tools. And so they're way over-licensed. And so they don't have any sort of operating expense latitude in terms of getting help for these types of projects. So they over-license the tools that they've got, or they don't automate repetitive and time-consuming tasks at all. And so they're burning a lot of effort on repetitive stuff, and then they're burning a ton of time and attention to a certain extent and getting alert fatigue. So they're getting a ton of alerts that don't necessarily signify anything that they need to deal with. And so changing that scheme quite a bit and saying, I'm only going to alert if it's something I actually need to act on, versus going ahead and sending the rest of the detective controls to something that's going to create a roll-up report. And then the roll-up report is usually your morning coffee type routine where you go ahead and read through that either daily or weekly. You go ahead and read through, but you don't use alerting for that type of data. If you're not going to go ahead and act on it, unless for some reason there's an exception, go ahead and roll that into a report. Don't have that go to an SMS or a page. Again, if you're doing this stuff already, awesome. If you're not, it's something to kind of take away and to help improve efficiency and reduce that sort of friction. The other thing, and this is kind of a nuance as we were talking through network segmentation efforts, something that I learned as we were going through is that the process of asking that how and why led to finding things that were over-licensed in the environment or finding things that were just outright inefficient in what we were doing in IT. And we somehow gained back a ton of time as we were going ahead and taking segment by segment and doing these things, but we also gained back money. We realized we'd way over-licensed in terms of some of the the GL or the general ledger and the financial type stuff, and we'd given basically all of finance to it. They didn't absolutely need it. So all of a sudden we rolled back a bunch of licensing there and gained a little bit of money back and so on and so forth. We found a bunch of different wins like that as we went through that we never would have if we didn't go ahead and start taking apart the network piece by piece. So the other thing is that while you're doing this, there's good news out there. But there's also unfortunately going to be bad news, right? As you go through, you're going to be finding things that are broken or incredibly insecure or need patching or whatever else. And you're going to have to go ahead and document those things. And I'll be talking about a strategy as well to kind of not let that overwhelm or sidetrack you. But the other nuance is that this knowledge, this taking apart the network and understanding how the business flows through it is incredibly empowering. And so the staff that you do have are able to work more effectively, and they stop making decisions that are going to cause a ton of friction and a ton of noise as well. And so you find that there are wins where you go ahead and are setting up completely separate projects, but because you understand a good deal more of exactly how the business flows through your network and how it's segmented, you're going to be doing better in other projects as well. So it's not necessarily all bad news. But if you don't ever do this, if you don't ever go ahead and attack this particular burden, you're never going to be able to go ahead and catch up and have those particular wins. It's sort of like, it's as akin to doing automation in your environment and scripting, or learning touch typing instead of hunting and pecking or whatever else. If you don't take the time to do it, then you're never going to see the efficiency gains associated with all that work. And so that's an important nuance as well that I kind of picked up on as we were doing this. The third barrier that we typically see is our firewall cannot handle all the internal traffic on our network, and our budget won't cover buying another. And so traffic going ahead and overrunning a internal firewall as you start pointing everything to it. And this is a legit concern. This can absolutely happen, and there's ways around it to a certain extent, but some ways we're going to have to be talking about going ahead and justifying the purchase of possibly another device of some sort. The one thing I would say, and again, this is sort of baby steps or whatever else, but use a phased approach. Don't take the biggest, loudest thing on your network and go ahead and try to segment that first. That's going to go ahead and cause tons of problems. But the other thing is that take a look at what existing traffic is going through your firewall. That might be a clue already about where segmentation needs to happen, but it also may be a clue that you've got a ton of noise going through your firewall that doesn't necessarily have to. So maybe you can offload those particular ACLs down one level to a core or a distribution switch and reduce some of that noise necessarily on your firewall. If you're going ahead and taking those syslogs from your switches and your core and sending them to a SIM and going ahead and doing alerting that way, that might be a way that you can kind of save yourself a little bit of traffic. But it depends entirely on what you want to segment out and the level of logging that you want and the level of segmentation. The other thing that we see is that vendors will sometimes suggest, well, if you're seeing a high memory, high utilization, high CPU, go ahead and turn down the logging level, especially on internet egress traffic. If you do that, you're going to be sacrificing a good deal of your audit trail. I would not go ahead and take that particular vendor advice. So that's not what I'm advising, is going ahead and turning down that level of auditing trail. Because you're going to lose that ability to say exactly what they exfiltrated out of your firewall, and that's no good either in terms of a breach investigation. So the other thing is, like I said, consider offloading your ACLs off to separate switches. And so if you have some ability to go ahead and do one of the suggestions, by the way, as I was talking about this, and Jerry Bell, Malicious Link, I think posted a link to port isolation. And so if you haven't looked into port isolation on your distribution switches, it is basically, it turns off that implicit allow between ports in the same segment where everything on the switch can go ahead and talk, and it doesn't go up a level or down a level in your environment. If you don't need that, you can go ahead and turn on port isolation for each port, and then they have to go back to whatever the next hop is, which could be your firewall or your core. And from that point, you can do workstation to workstation isolation. Now that's not in lieu of doing a local firewall or a local intrusion prevention solution, but it should be layered on top of that particular strategy. But that was a particularly good one. So if you see him, thank him for me. I did online. Is Jerry here? Anybody know? Okay. Awesome. And then the last thing, and this is again kind of a nuance, is if you can't absolutely route everything through your firewall, and you know you absolutely need to. So you've already curbed a lot of this inefficiency. You looked for a lot of this noise. You figured, certain things you can go ahead and offload, and you're still overloading the particular device you have. It may not be designed for an internal network segmentation effort, and that's very possible. There's some lower level Palo Altos that only allow like 500 or 5,000 ACLs total. Now, in typical environments, you may not run over that amount, but as you start getting close to that, you'll hit your memory and CPU and throughput caps and things like that. And so it's possible that you're going ahead and overrunning your particular device. And if that happens, one of the things that we need to get across to our superiors is that network segmentation is not a nice to have anymore. It's not like it going from the A to the A+. It's absolutely essential in terms of going ahead and containing these new threats, or the existing threats that we've got. It's been essential for a long time. It's a foundation of doing good networking. So this is our day job to a certain extent. Saying that you can't do this and your day job, this is part of the security realm at this point. So we need to accept that, and we also need to communicate that upwards. And so we'll be talking a little bit about how to communicate that upwards. When I started doing this, I realized that one of the barriers was me, right? So I was fighting back and I was pushing back at people, and I was being resistant to actually learning the business. But the other thing is that I had a sense of learned helplessness. And so I thought, well, if I can't figure this out, oh well. I guess, there's nothing that can be done about it. And so I kind of had this initial barrier where, I would just give up way, way too easy. So I needed to break that down as well. Learn to recognize that to a certain extent, and learn to call it out to your peers as well. So if they're doing it or you're doing it, that's one of the things that can absolutely mire down a internal segmentation effort, is that kind of, well, if this doesn't work, I guess we're just going to give up on it. There are ways through this particular problem. Sometimes you just have to push harder, and sometimes you have to find a different workaround or a different business justification to go ahead and get through it. But it's definitely a thing. The other thing is that as you discover these particular problems, so as you're going through your network, you're going to be discovering things that are horribly broken, horribly bad, unpatched, telnet in places where you really, really don't want it, or things where people say, I absolutely can't patch this particular solution. And so you're going to need to find ways to contain those things that you can't patch if the vendor indeed won't allow you to do that. And they're going to mire down, to a certain extent, your forward progress, your forward momentum. One of the things that I had found was that I was starting to get overwhelmed, right? I was trying to keep these all in my head, or keeping like post-it notes at my desk or whatever else, but I wasn't communicating these things either upwards or across to my peers. So I was holding on to quite a few of them. And again, that was kind of feeding into that self-defeating behavior. We're never going to get through this because I keep on discovering crap on the network. What are we going to do? And so one of the things that I ended up doing was a state of infrastructure report, where I basically took, and it was like a still broken list or whatever else, of all the things that we found that were broken. And the list kept on building, but we started knocking things out as we were doing network segmentation, but we also got a chance to share that up the chain. And I didn't realize how much that saved me from over-coffeeing, over-drinking, not sleeping, everything else like that, is because it kind of burned away that stress to a certain extent. There were other people that knew about these particular broken things, and so I wasn't the only one holding on to them. They were still my responsibility to fix, but at least there was shared sort of responsibility in doing that. The other thing is that I was viewing our compliance burden. So we had a PCI environment that we'd already segmented out, but I was viewing that as a burden. And so I was saying, okay, every time right around April or so, we're not going to get any work done until the beginning of June. And that's just the way it is. And, we're going to dread it and stuff like that, but we're not going to go ahead and get anything done. And not utilizing that was a big shortcoming of mine. I didn't realize that in and of itself is leverage. That is justification for going ahead and getting a lot of these other initiatives done. And it so clearly points to budget, and it so clearly points to business risk and all of that. It's incredibly easy to go ahead and make that justification and not necessarily to use the auditors as a club, if you will, but learn to absolutely love those particular rules and apply them. And you use that kind of as a talking point towards getting network segmentation done or other security projects done. Now, as you do that, unfortunately, you're going to learn to have to communicate security gaps into business risks. And that's one of the takeaways that I learned going through a segmentation project is you will never do this just solely by knowing all of the technical aspects of the particular technical platform that you're trying to segment. onto. You will have to learn a little bit of the business language. You'll have to learn the workflows in order to do this correctly and to finish this and then to maintain it. And so in doing that, metrics are absolutely your friend. Documented task cycles, checklists, descriptions, all of this in a wiki so that you understand it, but also the people around you understand it. So that if somebody leaves your security team and another person gets onboarded, they can quickly become more aware, again, of the why and the how of how your network is operating, and so they don't make dumb suggestions. That the initial, hey, let's go ahead and cut all of this off. Well, no, we can't do that because of this, 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 and this. You don't want that to be tribal knowledge. You want that to be somewhere documented, obviously secure, right? You don't want to give a hack me kit, sort of thing. And I've run into a few customers that have had their internal wiki exposed to the outside for convenience sake. Don't do that either. But go ahead and have that documented. That will help you out a ton. And the other thing, and this is something I didn't anticipate, was that as you're doing these particular things, obviously people talk in your environment. And so I wasn't expecting the talk where I'm going up from the lobby up to my particular floor. CEO jumps in and goes, so how's that security project going? And I missed an opportunity, right? Because I could have said, hey, it's going really, really well. I've got a report and what we're going to run into is around 60% or 70% of doing this. We're going to go ahead and run out of money. Or we're going to run out of funding. We're going to need to go ahead and buy more. I wasn't ready to go ahead and give numbers. I wasn't ready to go ahead and say exactly when we were going to hit that gap and all of that. That would have absolutely helped. That would have been amazing in terms of timing, and I could have had a good win, a good conversation, and a good justification. I wasn't ready to do that. And so luck favors the prepared. Get that ready beforehand for the next bad instance or the next, just weird elevator conversation where you're going to go ahead and have. It's, like I said, doing that research as well will help you, call out exactly when you might run into problems, and help you figure out your strategy, but it also, help call that up to your execs. So if there is no dialogue, and this is what I hit in another organization, is every single money discussion that we would have would be shut down. We don't have money. Sorry. Yeah, you're going to have to figure out how to do it just with what you've got, or figure out a way to make more money, or free up more money in your existing budget. We're not paying you anymore at this point to go ahead and do this. And that really, really caused some friction because we were thinking we were pretty lean and fairly efficient. We'd gone ahead and knocked down a bunch of these things, and at that point we just couldn't make it work anymore. One of the strategies that we did was we took every incident that came out, and this was around, I want to say, Heartbleed, Shell Shock, Poodle, right around there. We went ahead and took every particular incident where we needed to communicate up, what this particularly happened. So we gave a quick executive brief of why you should care about this, what it is, and what we did. What we did to go ahead and remediate it. And they loved it, right? Because we just gave them within 8 hours or thereabouts, they had something where if they got hit on it, the CEO, the CFO, the head of legal, if they got hit on it, they could speak intelligently to it, or at least crib the notes and kind of read them out loud. So, yep, our IT department has told us about this, which was great. But one thing we snuck in there after a few of those was, hey, what would happen if we were the primary target? So if we didn't get advance notice because they went ahead and hacked us first and said, of getting the news that, hey, this poor unfortunate company got hacked and here's a patch now. So how would we have fared if there was no patch or if there was no advanced warning? And they didn't like that answer at all. They didn't want that in email. They didn't want to hear it and stuff like that. But, unfortunately, it's the truth and it's bad news. And so we had to deliver it. But then we started talking about, hey, here's how we would have fared. Here's how we could have fared if we were able to do this particular project, or we're able to justify these possible things. And we have a attached report, or we have the capability to go ahead and remediate these things. We want to have that conversation. And I'd love to tell you that worked. It didn't work for the first 5 times. And basically we just got dead air. They didn't want to talk about it. They kind of grumbled about, again, the bad news in there, but also grumbled about taking a bad opportunity or a bad event and then go ahead and asking for money. They didn't particularly enjoy that. But around the 5th time of seeing that and kind of internalizing this risk and looking at all the different companies that kind of got either owned or knocked offline for quite a bit, they started asking questions back and going, okay, well, if we can't give you this budget, what if we gave you this? What if we gave you more consulting dollars? So if we didn't give you capital budget, what if we gave you OpEx and gave you some more help and go ahead and knocking these things through? So the conversation changed a little bit, and we earned some face time. to a certain extent. That can considerably help. Not that money solves all of this, but it definitely can help if you're kind of tech-bound in terms of those things. So let's talk about what the finish line looks like. It's going to be different for everybody, but we're generally going to be going from this Chewy center model. We're basically going to be exploding out different segments. And one of those, they're not particularly showing up as gray, at least for me, but what those little bubbles effectively are is there's no implicit trust anymore. We're not doing an implicit trust model. We're doing granular ACLs to each one of these particular segments. And so we know specifically what they need to go ahead and connect to. And so every time a sales laptop is connecting through the distribution switch, through NAC, through the core, through the firewall, out to the app servers, we know exactly what ports they need to connect to, and we know what user groups need to connect to those particular things. And so we're segmenting those out by AD groups or, some other grouping that your firewall can do to go ahead and allow very, very specific and constrained access. And likewise, we're breaking all these other things out. And then we also added, in our case, we added a DB proxy in front of our database server so that we could kind of clue in on exactly when those giant queries came through that didn't seem legit or some sort of possible exfiltration attempt. Or just inefficiency, right? Because there could be users that don't know what they're looking for and they just do a select star just to go ahead and grab the entire database. We didn't want that either. We didn't want them, driving up the utilization. And the segmentation effort allowed us to do that. We also had particularly old web presence. And so one of the things that we got justified was a web app firewall to stand in front of that. And so our web devs couldn't secure a lot of these things against the common attacks, but the web app firewall could. And so it was, kind of a half-assed solution. It's not something that I'd recommend. You ideally want to secure the source and have something in front of it. It's also secure. But in this case, it worked in terms of at least stopping the external attacks against that particular platform, or slowing them down. But this map is going to look different for absolutely everybody. The important takeaway, though, is that the exactness of detail that you have about your business workflows should be consistently high. So you should consistently know exactly, again, which group is connecting to what and why, and how often. And your any allows, so any in terms of the ports, any in terms of the groups, any in terms of the destinations, all of that. Your amount of any rules that are in an allow category should be close to 0. And if they're not, then you continually have more work to do. You should be able to define what normal is for any given workflow and be able to kind of tell what abnormal is. And that's kind of the next level. That's what network segmentation kind of gives you, or this effort kind of give you, is the ability to tell what abnormal traffic kind of looks like. There are obviously automated platforms that do that. Rapid7 sells one, for example. There's a ton of them. Splunk sells another one. But they'll look at user behavior analytics and be able to tell you what abnormal traffic is, but there is no substitution for you knowing that and you being able to do customized detection routines based on what normal versus abnormal is. So if there's a system that's not hit but once a month or once a year, and you know it's being hit daily or once every second, that's abnormal traffic. That's something you should absolutely be looking into. But you'd never know that if you didn't crawl through your particular environment and look at what you need to segment out. ACLs, obviously, like I said, should have remarks or callouts. They should have definitions that go back to wiki pages if you can't get everything in the particular comments, or change management tickets. That will give you, like I said, your ability to go ahead and track these things back. But the other thing is, you're going to be having conversations with all of these different departments and talking about, as their workflow changes, you're going to be talking about going ahead and segmenting this traffic out. You're not going to remember, a year from now or whatever else, what this particular department does. And so it allows you to go ahead basically and refresh and crib your notes before you go ahead and talk to them. If you don't have that documented, you're going to have to learn it over and over and over again, and you're going to be seen as that guy that doesn't particularly care. That knowledge tends to communicate empathy for what they're doing as a business. And if you have that, like I said, when you're going ahead and communicating to them and saying, I need these things, you're doing so in the context of what they do and what it does for the business. That makes all the difference in the world in terms of getting what you're aiming for as well. You're going to be logging ACL drops as well. So you're going to be looking at research to see if you can alert on a number of drops within a certain amount of time. If you're in the Palo Alto environment, I know that's called a vulnerability protection profile. I don't know what it's called in Cisco parlance in the Firepower suite. You may know. alert on the number of drops in a given amount of time? Okay. Just curious. The last thing I learned as I went through this is, like I said, not only communicating all of these particular things that we found that were insecure to my peers, but we also added peer enforcement, where we basically said all of our peers are going to go ahead and review these particular rules. And so we had a rule base of 1,000 rules. So we knew we didn't want to sit in a meeting and review 1,000 rules all at once. And so what we did was we broke them up into 200 rules at a time and met for an hour. And went through and discussed those 200. And there was some peer enforcement of going, why are we alerting on that? I don't care about that. Tell me exactly what's important about these particular things. Or why haven't we been able to segment that? And so we got a lot of good discussion and pushback internally to be able to continue this project. And this is all about maintaining focus and maintaining effort to a certain extent to get this project done. And so that helps considerably. It also helps considerably in terms of defining what's normal faster. People tend to ask questions in terms of, okay, is this set up the way we want it? Is this normal, or is this too broad, or do we need, separate rules that only take into account certain alerting based on a monthly pattern, or so on and so forth. If you're doing this right, you're spending less money and placing your detective controls more effectively. Your network and your ACLs start looking more and more like your business and less like the vendor defaults, which means you're going to give pen testers a lot harder time to go ahead and navigate your network, or attackers to navigate your network. And as a result, you're going to force them to have to do more recon. And as they do recon, you have opportunities to go ahead and pick up on those recon events and possibly trigger alerts and possibly contain them. And those are all absolutely wonderful things. Like I said, consider the network isolation at the port isolation level. But also, when you learn all this stuff, it becomes somewhat trivial to go ahead and turn on local firewalls. It becomes trivial to turn on host intrusion protection profiles. So you get all these benefits out of these things, all these tangents that work out really, really well too, to kind of do a layered defense in depth strategy. There was a few questions in terms of, are you going to hit the overall ACL limits for a given platform? In doing some research, there's only a few where we might get close to that particular bottleneck. I have not seen a network yet that's over 5,000 individual ACLs that's well segmented. I have seen over 2,000. But I'm just, every environment's different. Take this with a large grain of salt. This depends a lot more based on, your overall throughput and a lot of other things that you're doing with your firewall. And so just looking at the number of ACLs is a horrible way to evaluate a platform. But just FYI, this is the theoretical limit on the number of ACLs that you could possibly have. Some of these, correct. Right, how much you can process is completely different. But yeah. They don't brag about these. Like, it took a while to dig these up. And so these weren't primary in terms of their spec sheets and all of that. The Cisco ones were just purely from the forums, from Cisco administrators reporting back and going, yes, theoretically you could load this many. But yeah, you will hit the limits long before these points. But if you have a concern about 1,000 or 2,000, you're not going to hit anything in terms of just the ACL limits. Before we get to questions, I just wanted to take a second and, we're at 5 minutes, okay. I just wanted to thank Rapid7 and particularly Megan Wu for encouraging me to go ahead and give this talk and continually kind of check in with me and go, are you closer to going ahead and developing the talk? Are you going ahead, are you going to go ahead and sub? So thank you so much. I really appreciate it. And thanks to my entire team, Advisory Services, for being here, including Jay Radcliffe, which apparently is just a giant cutout head of Jay Radcliffe. Any questions? There's a microphone over there. There we go.
You were talking about like Cisco ASAs, Palazos, etc. Why not something like pfSense?
In terms of your own setup, in terms of like customized setup, going ahead and doing that, so you don't have to pay a vendor for. Gotcha. Nothing particularly that would stop you from necessarily doing that. So what I'm doing at home with Lead, which is a fork of OpenWRT, I'm looking at Ryman.io as well to kind of do some of the similar stuff. But in terms of a larger setup, so sometimes the vendors go ahead and take some of the setup burden off of your shoulders. That's the only thing I could say necessarily for doing it. But I don't think there's anything particularly wrong about going ahead and kind of making your own path in terms of that. So, yeah, I can't think of anything that would necessarily stop you other than, I mean, there's some really, really nice profiles and some really, really nice stuff already set up, at least on the PA platform, as far as looking at groups or they have a migration tool that you can go ahead and evaluate your entire rule base and then say how many rules, what percentage of rules have this level of broadness. There we go, 3 minutes. This level of broadness and should be narrowed down and so on and so forth. There are also platforms like Nipper that go ahead and let you evaluate a given rule base, and I don't think Nipper is compatible with pfSense yet, but they allow you to do a benchmarks-based evaluation of the entire configuration and call out some issues as well. And so those would be the only things, is you couldn't do those advanced sort of hardening and optimization against the rule base. But that's not to say that you couldn't do that manually anyway. And there's a good amount of value associated with, if you do it by hand manually, you're going to be thinking a lot more about your particular setup. And so I don't like to poo-poo, kind of doing it all sort of manually, but it depends on how much time you've got and what tools you have at your disposal. Any other questions? Go ahead. Okay. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Right. Mm-hmm. Yeah. So for our environment, we were having a hell of a time getting a web app firewall tuned. And the network team just couldn't get the rules right without being disruptive. And we went back and forth. And we ended up throwing that back up to management. And my VP basically said, for every solution that the app devs come up with, that we have to go ahead and harden, they're going to have to sit with you and troubleshoot back and forth on the particular web app firewall. And so it was a shared responsibility. That's one way to break that particular silo down, is if you have to. If it's made a job requirement or a job responsibility, obviously that's a more harsh way to do it than the social aspect of going, hey, I understand what this app does, but I don't understand what it needs, and kind of going that route. But the soft approach obviously is saying, hey, I understand what this does in terms of the business, I understand your requirements, I understand how the app works, I just don't understand how to secure it. Starting with that language, maybe the best way to approach, and then if that fails, then you can go back to leadership and say, look, I've given it my best effort, been empathetic, I've learned, I've crossed that gray area, I've gone beyond my particular wall into their area, tried to learn this out, and it hasn't worked. Can you make this a shared responsibility as part of their job responsibility? And then all of a sudden, it's weird how things get solved as soon as it becomes a necessary requirement. All right. I do need to give the podium up to the next speaker, but if you want, go ahead and hit me up at BeattyJ on Twitter. You can ask more questions there. Thank you.